Lastly, there are a number of other neurotransmitters. There's ATP, there's vasoactive intestinal peptide, there's nitric oxide, okay? And these are other neurotransmitters that we have, right? And the only one I really want you to know is NO, okay, nitric oxide, okay? Nitric oxide gets released, and we saw this in memory, right? It helps to lower the inhibition that occurs on the preganglionic neuron to help bolster excitation. Norepinephrine can be a neurotransmitter. It's non-adrenergic, it's non-cholinergic. It doesn't fit any of those molds, all right? But it is important because it does help with relaxation of blood vessels, which is important for the erection of the penis. If we don't get that to happen, magic doesn't happen. Okay. Parasympathetic neurons innervate blood vessels, causes relaxation and vasodilation using that nitric oxide. Again, it's used in a number of other locations as well. Relaxation, vasodilation, opening up. So there are a number of other neurotransmitters as well. The only one I want you to know is nitric oxide. This vasoactive intestinal peptide is something newer, and they've just kind of learned about what it does and its influence on the digestive tract, smooth muscle activity and other locations as well. So it's somewhat of a newer one, but nitric oxide is the only one I would like you to know here when it comes to other neurotransmitters. So let's look at how these things are innervated. For the vast majority of all of our organs here that we're going to be looking at, everybody gets input from both of these branches of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. For most of these for most of these systems, they are antagonistic to one another. One increases, one decreases. Heart rate, classic example, okay? Sympathetic increases, parasympathetic decreases. You want to pump harder and faster. You're running from the bobcat. Parasympathetic, rest and digest, right? Digestive function, another classic example of these two things, of dual innervation. Here, sympathetic decreases, parasympathetic increases. Again, rest and digest. Fight or flight, you don't care if you digest that ham sandwich that you just ate before you walked out in the parking lot and had to run from the bobcat. Doesn't matter. Sometimes it can be complementary. Okay, so we can have usually antagonistic, but sometimes they can be complementary, okay, where they both produce similar effects. Salivary glands is an example of this. Parasympathetic stimulates secretion. Sympathetic, you still get a secretion, it's just thicker. Okay? Constricts the blood vessels, so the secretion is thicker. Okay, so there are these things called complementary effects. So we have antagonistic, we have complementary, and we have this thing called cooperative, where both are needed to get the event to happen. Two great examples of this, okay? Different effects that work to promote a single action. Cooperative. I need these both to happen for magic to happen. The classic example is the erection and the ejaculation process in the male. Parasympathetic causes vasodilation. I need vasodilation. This relaxes the blood vessels down there in the dorsal, dorsal penis veins. Allows that erectile tissue to engorge with blood. The sympathetic effect is what gets the ejaculation process to occur. Okay? Once you've reached climax, it helps to get all of the tubes within the male reproductive system to start contracting, the muscles within the pelvic floor to start contracting to eject that semen during the process. Urination also is a classic example of dual innervation. You can see there, parasympathetic aids in urinary bladder contraction. Sympathetic helps with bladder muscle tone to control that urination. Okay? And there are a number of different medications that are used to kind of help with bladder control issues to block if you have trouble, contracting the bladder to fully empty, or if you have trouble controlling your urination, and you don't completely void when you are going to the urination process. There are a number of other effects out here, and this is just here to kind of show you. I'm not going to ask anything off this. There's a lot of effects for the adrenergic, the cholinergic type of receptors here, and kind of what those do. Muscarinic, you can see over there as well. So again, it's just to kind of give you an example. There's a lot of interaction between these. Okay, they can be cooperative, complementary, antagonistic. Right? We can have all of the above when it comes to this. Mostly we think of it as antagonistic. That's the vast majority of what we think of. But sometimes they complement, or they both cause the same thing. Both causes secretion here. Just one is a little bit more watery and one's a little bit more thicker. Or they could be both needed to get the event to happen. And the classic example of here is in the male, erection and ejaculation is the very classic example that most gets discussed and talked about. The vast majority of them all get input for the most part, except a few things. Okay, and this is probably the most obvious one here. Okay? These are sympathetic only. It's sympathetic tissue, right? It developed in the same vein as sympathetic tissue in the ganglia. So that's only sympathetic. There's no parasympathetic input here. Okay, the erector pili muscles in the skin is only sympathetic. Okay? Sweat glands only sympathetic. Blood vessels are mostly sympathetic. Okay, we talk about parasympathetic and vasodilation, but really it's a little bit more complicated than that. Usually, it's increased sympathetic input or decreased sympathetic input. Right, parasympathetic input will have an effect some other place, which will then affect sympathetic input to those blood vessels. So it's kind of weird. There's a number of autonomic reflexes as well. And these are going to be, in the brainstem, in the pons, in the medulla oblongata, in the midbrain. That's where we're going to find a lot of these things. And we will look at all of these ad nauseum when we get into those individual units, when we look at cardiovascular and how the heart is going to be affected, how the blood vessels will be affected, how you breathe, how fast you breathe, how we regulate that. Okay, how we regulate that, digestive functions, urinary functions, reproductive, all of that needs a number of brain centers. So we regulate a lot of this stuff. So even though it's all involuntary and it just happens, and the heart can contract on its own, it does receive advice. It does receive input from these brain centers. And again, we have a number of them. Water, food, sex, hypothalamus, limbic system, emotional response, cerebellum with motion sickness, sweating, cardiovascular changes that occur there, frontal and temporal lobes, again, with emotion and personality. So there are a number of higher order brain structures that will also infer an effect on this autonomic nervous system. It's not all just receptors in a specific region causing this to happen. A lot of stuff has to go up into the brain to be bounced around and figured out. Aging is kind of interesting. As you age, it's usually associated with an increased level of sympathetic activity, which is stress, right? This is why elderly people, they're in a pro-inflammatory state because of stress. Stress affects them a heck of a lot differently than it does when you're younger. It's just increased sympathetic tone with increased levels of sympathetic activity, sympathetic tone that further perpetuates, hypertension issues, cardiovascular disease. So it can make high blood pressure worse as you get older, and it can further advance the disease to cause more sclerotic changes to happen to those blood vessel walls. this is just some other ones. I'm not going to ask you any of these here. You could see there's a bunch of crazy receptors there, type J receptors. Crazy, right? But here you can kind of see some of the things that are transmitted to those autonomic ganglia and the event that they hold. I will not ask anything off this. Okay, I'll put an X over it. I will not ask anything off 45. It's just there to show you there's always more. There's always more.